Hello, and welcome to our lecture on Chapter 6, Communication. So today we'll be talking through Chapter 6, which gives us bits and pieces about communication concepts and frameworks, and kind of sets the stage for the next 3 to 4 chapters where we'll dive into some of the more nuanced aspects of communication. So when we think about the act of communication, we have to really keep in mind the sender, the receiver, the message, all of those key pieces we learn about in basic communication theory. But also, as health services administrators, we have to step back and take a much broader viewpoint, realizing that quite often we are communicating both in what's said and what's not said, in our mannerisms, in the way that we speak, in what we choose to share, in the way that we craft an email or don't follow up via email. Everything that we do is building a reputation and set of relationships and leading to our understanding of organizational politics. And so we have to, let's take it a couple steps back. Let's take a moment and consider what Aristotle first said about communication. And he described communication as a primarily linear, straightforward, one-line process involving a speaker and a listener. And as you know, communication is far more nuanced than that. You may say something to someone in a meeting. There are multiple people there who are adding context and background, agreeing, disagreeing. And then that message gets carried out of that room to other rooms and other conversations. And so it's really important that we're really keen and careful in the way that we create messages and that we do so in a way that is consistent because our reputation is built off of consistent positive messaging. For example, I've had moments in my career where someone said, "Oh, Ashley said this not nice thing." And my boss has said, "No, Ashley wouldn't say that," based on the merit of who Ashley is. You build a reputation for yourself, right? And every communication is layered in as part of that set of norms. So I want you to keep that in mind. All right, so going back to Aristotle, there are 3 elements of communication that he discussed. The first one I just discussed, the ethos, the character, both the character, meaning you are a character, but also your character, who you are, your reputation, your identity, the emotion of the message, the tone, the inflection, the intent, and the logic, the actual information being conveyed. And all 3 of these come together to be a message. Now, I know that you've experienced situations, I have in my life, where I heard something that someone else didn't. So we both are recipients of the same message, but I walked away with a different understanding than they did. So in Aristotle's Means of Persuasion, he discusses the idea that our message is packaged by who we are, the emotion of what we said, and the logic of what we said. It all comes together. Who's speaking, with what emotion, with what logic. And so it's really important to keep that in mind because you may say something direct, honest, and thoughtful, but if that person doesn't know of your reputation or doesn't trust you, they may not perceive it as direct, honest, and thoughtful. And so it's our responsibilities to create psychological safety and positive organizational culture and build a positive reputation for ourselves and our peers so that we can communicate effectively. Now, one of the components to this, and I know we hear it all the time, is effective listening. And with effective listening, quite often I hear advice around, listen in proportion. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? Famous saying. I want to caution you that listening closely is a skill. But it's also a skill when you can reflect it back. When you can show someone that you paid attention, you thoughtfully considered their words, and you've composed a thoughtful response, and not always a response, maybe a consideration, maybe it's a way you respond at the next meeting. Maybe it's something that you do to support them based on what you heard. It doesn't have to be a quick narrative response. So effective leaders know how to listen and observe carefully. They also know how to consider the message. Think about the sender, the content, the medium in which it's sent. Is this an email? Is it a presentation? Is it an open forum? So we consider the full context and we prepare ourselves, not for an immediate response, but knowing that if we provide meaningful feedback, individuals will share more. They will learn from the experience of sharing. And so we want to be aware of that, and also aware when we receive a message of all of the psychological, the cognitive, the critical thinking, and the contextual factors, the environment, the mood, and make sure that we understand that context of how the message is being sent. So here is a really high-level sender-receiver feedback model. We've got the sender that sends a message. Let's say this is content about a new program at the hospital that will allow individuals to promote over time and achieve a slightly higher ranking within their discipline. Maybe we're creating what we call career ladders, where we have a level 1, 2, 3 in each role. The sender puts all of that information into an email and sends it out to all the various departments. And they say, if you have any feedback on the policy, please let us know. And then individuals maybe can complete a feedback survey, or maybe they respond to the email. That is going to generate much different feedback than if it was just shared openly in a meeting, maybe. So we have to make sure that we're using the right medium, the right method of communication, and also that we're removing opportunity for any distortion. And that's one of the things that I like about emails. Written word is very clear in many cases if used appropriately, but there's also limitations there because it's harder to finesse or change your mind if you need to regroup a little bit. So to communicate effectively, we need to understand the situation we're in. The history. You may say something that you intend to be casual and light, but you didn't realize there's a history behind certain interactions. The social context. Who are you sharing information with, and at what speed, in what manner? Did you clear it with your supervisor first before you shared the update? Are you sharing things that align with people's belief system and values, or are you sharing something new and different that maybe needs a little bit of an introduction? Right? So the goal with communicating effectively is to make sure you identify your audience very specifically. You analyze their context, their history, their situation, to make sure you can craft an engaging two-way interaction that serves the purposes you need. Now, we also want to leave room for as much organizational learning as possible. We want people to be part of the problem solving, part of the developing of solutions and implementing solutions. So you have to leave that space. It can't just be, this is the problem, this is what we're doing, thank you very much. In some cases, that's what we have to do, but in many cases, it's about creating an open dialogue and in some cases, persuading and engaging folks to support your efforts. So depending on what you're doing, your purpose of your communication, who you're communicating the message to, those two things together determine the method used. If I need to build internal support for a new initiative, I'm going to hold a town hall. I'm going to send information out in a newsletter. I'm not going to call every employee one at a time from my desk. But if I'm doing marketing and sales, I would do that. I would do calls from my desk. Right? So we have to make sure we're choosing the right method. Email is not always the right method, right? We also have to keep in mind the speed at which we need the communication to occur and any likelihood that it might be misunderstood. Might it need context or the ability to immediately ask questions? Now, there are a lot of things that can distort communication. We refer to distortion as any time when the individual who's receiving the message does not receive or fully understand the message. Maybe they block the message, but it's not getting through, or the wrong understanding has occurred. And one of the reasons this happens is something called the curse of knowledge. So I've been teaching organizational behavior for a little bit over a decade. I've been teaching healthcare management courses since 2013. I've been teaching adult learners since 2010. And in those interactions, I've learned and I've gotten more comfortable. But it has been a curse in some ways because I can talk to you for 20 minutes about something important. And in those 20 minutes, I can feel like I have achieved something. So in those 20 minutes, I can feel like I've achieved something, like I've conveyed a message. But that lecture maybe used to be an hour. But now I'm used to saying the same words in the same way, and it's quicker. That doesn't mean you understood it. I understood it because I've said it 100 times. And so one of the curses of knowledge is you assume that everyone else, in some ways, has the pieces of information you have, has the level of depth and understanding. And so sometimes we rush, we make assumptions. And that can be frustrating for the people who are trying to piece together the information you're sharing. Also, quite often, we can have barriers to communication. Things like negative or ambiguous relationships. Maybe I don't get along with someone I work with because of something they said a long time ago. And I'm not saying this is my case. I'm just saying in our fictitious example. And because of that, anything they say in the future, I don't trust. Doesn't matter if they're being honest or not, that negative relationship has impacted, right? Going back to the idea that it's character, emotion, and logic. Their character, my perception of them, impacts my reception of the message. This also applies to any poor credibility on a larger scale, any conflicting belief systems, or just different communication styles. All of that can lead to barriers in communication and misunderstanding. We have to realize that trust is built moment by moment, interaction by interaction. And if we don't take the time to build that trust, if we take it for granted, we can end up in a situation where no one believes or understands our messages because we haven't taken the time to cultivate that trust. And again, on a broader scale, that feeds into not just a trust in a one-on-one relationship, but your credibility as a professional. If the ability for folks not only to believe you, but to take you seriously, to think you are competent, you know what you're talking about, you have focused expertise, and you're trustworthy. All of these are important. And I'm going to give you a silly example story here. Early on in my career, I was working as a senior decision support analyst in a hospital. And I had been tasked with a really strange task because my job was mostly doing financial analysis, but I was tasked with picking up invoices for physicians and making sure they got paid on time for certain I hate to say high value contacts, we all are valuable, but just physicians who they wanted to make sure they got paid right away. And so it was my job for this county hospital to walk the invoice through the process and make sure that these physicians got paid quickly because the hospital valued their business. Well, I was working on processing some physician invoices, and the folks in accounts payable, the process was taking a really long time. And the physician got really angry with me. And I said, look, I'm new to this role, and I am doing everything I can to get you paid as soon as possible. And every person who touches this invoice, I'm checking in with them and getting it taken care of. And the physician was pretty upset, pretty irate, called me an idiot, called me stupid, said some very mean things in words that I would not use in a recording. At some point in the exchange, I was emailing back and forth with the physician to straighten something out. Some of the paperwork was incorrect, which might have been why I was taking so long to get the physician paid. In that exchange, the physician noticed my information, had my name on there, Ashley Parks. And if you know anything about me, I have a lot of acronyms behind my name. And even back then, this was 15 years ago, I already had a master's degree and several acronyms behind my name. Immediately when that physician got that email, his tone changed. He said, oh, I had no idea you had an MPH and you were educated and you have this experience. And he was very nice. And I said, so if I didn't have a degree, I would still be stupid and useless, but now we're nice. Now, that's not appropriate. It's not okay. It's not acceptable. It's not inclusive at all. But it speaks to the concept of credibility. The fact that I had those things and I had built out my resume and was a growing professional gave me credibility. He believed me when I said that I was going to do what I said I was going to do because of those credentials. Is that appropriate? No, I didn't appreciate it. I didn't appreciate the things that were originally said, but it's an example of how perceived competence and expertise can sometimes make someone assume you are more trustworthy. So keep that in mind. It is always good to pursue education, to grow, to learn, but also to treat everyone with respect and give them the benefit of the doubt regardless of their background. All right. So as I said earlier, belief systems can also pose a barrier, right? Especially when we're dealing with individuals who are advocating for ideas that are maybe contrary to our core beliefs, maybe information that's hard for us to hear. And so we have to be willing to be flexible, especially in professional settings, but also communicate why we disagree. Communicate if there's a fundamental ethical or value conflict so that we can find a resolution. And beliefs, it's very important that we understand beliefs are different from interests. My self-interest, my desire to be successful, how I feel about pieces of the organization aren't necessarily my belief system. Those are my interests. And so it's important to realize we can compromise on interests in ways that maybe we're not willing or shouldn't compromise on beliefs, especially if our beliefs are tied to doing the right thing or acting ethically or appropriately. And then, of course, communication styles. If you've ever had someone that's ever been just a little too casual with you or hasn't given you the time and consideration you deserve, you know that communication, the way that something's packaged and managed, matters. And we call that framing. And that can powerfully affect somebody's perception if something's framed appropriately. For example, when that physician responded to me and said, "Thank you so much, Ms. Parks. I appreciate your help and support." That was very different than how he'd talked to me before, and he got a better response by treating me with courtesy, right? So how we frame things is important. Now, in healthcare, we're communicating with a lot of folks. One of the largest groups we communicate with is stakeholders, both externally and internally. And one of the tools that we use to decide how we're going to communicate with certain groups is a stakeholder analysis. So we actually look at the different roles of individuals, both within and outside our organization, and we look at their involvement in our project. Do they have specific power and influence or specific interest in what we're working on? And if so, how can we engage them in a productive way to move our aims forward? So this is a stakeholder map looking at external stakeholders for a large academic hospital. They need to deal with the state medical association, with a local school of law, with county health departments. They have to maintain, build, perfect, right? Like really optimize relationships with each of these groups. And so communication is key. There's some groups in your life, and we could even jokingly use this as a family analogy if we wanted, but there's some individuals on our teams that we need to keep satisfied. We need to placate them, if you will. We need to keep them engaged and okay, but just keep them happy. We have other folks that we need to monitor. Maybe we need to monitor what they're working on because the tasks are difficult. We have others that we need to manage closely, and those we need to keep informed. Now you may ask, what's the difference between monitoring and managing closely? Let's look at this power interest matrix. On one side, we have individuals with greater power and influence. On the other side, we have folks with greater interest, more professional or personal interest in whatever project or effort you're working on. If someone has a lot of power and not a lot of interest, we just need to keep them happy. Keep them out of the meeting, right? Everything's going great, right? Just keep them moderately informed, but keep them okay. Now, if they have no real power, they're very interested, engage them, tell them things, keep them informed. If they have no power and no interest, we monitor. We see if their interest level changes over time. But if I'm working on a nursing-related project, maintenance doesn't care, probably, depending on the effort, right? But you want to check in with them, make sure they know what's going on and see if that interest level changes. Maybe they want to get engaged in some piece of it. And then we manage closely. We frequently update, we work with, we engage those who have a lot of power, a lot of influence, and a lot of interest in our project. And so this is an example of a stakeholder matrix. Now, we have a lot of different tools for managing communication, and on the next slide, I'm going to show you a few examples. We want to choose a method of communication that fits with our goals and the message that we're sending. So, for example, if we want to gather data or information from our stakeholders on their perspectives, and we have a lot of time, we may want to do structured interviews or open-ended interviews. If we don't have a lot of time, we may want to ask them just to fill out a quick survey with an open-ended essay question. So time is also an issue here. And anytime we're collecting data, trying to get feedback from large groups of people, we want to keep in mind, is this feedback we need to collect individually, or can we get the group in a room? One of the options that's listed is a brainstorming technique called nominal group technique, NGT. We can get everyone in a room and get them throwing out ideas and building off of one another for 1 to 2 hours. That's great if we're comfortable with everybody sharing feedback in the same environment. So that's part of it too. We may, in addition to doing survey questionnaires, we may want to do a workshop where we share messages and ask for feedback. Maybe we're trying to workshop a new marketing campaign. That might make sense to spend half a day doing that. But the type of communication method we use needs to be tightly tied to the goal of that communication, whether or not we want to capture feedback from everyone together or it needs to be separate, private, and whether or not we really want direct verbal feedback. Do we need everything in writing? So think about the deliverable that you're coming out of from this. Another new component to communication that wasn't as much of an issue is social media. But before we talk about social media, let's just talk about social networks. Each of us has connections with individuals around us in the broader environment. We explore those connections, we build trust and relationships to gain more social capital. And social capital, people believing in you, trusting you, that credibility is the most important asset for a communicator. So we build these connections, but there's this concept in social media and social networks, but also social media online, of contagion. How quickly a piece of information can spread. And so we have to keep that in mind because sometimes information spreads very quickly, sometimes not. And so we want to make sure we tell the key people first so that they don't hear it from someone else, if you will. This is an example of a social network map. Right there in the middle, the darkest circle is the main person who is connected to all the people in gray, who are connected to the people in light blue, then darker blue. Very involved, right? But there are a lot of different types of communication networks. This might be how one message gets spread. But if we look at it on a smaller scale, we can communicate information in a chain. We tell one person who we know will tell another person who we know will tell another person. Maybe we use a wheel communication method where we sit down and we tell several people at once and it goes out from there. You'll notice that a lot of communication ends up very close to this last category, the all-channel communication, where instead of communicating just to one person, we send communications to large groups of people who then disperse it amongst themselves and refine their opinions together. That's all channel. And so when we think about communication, we have to almost assume that any information we share will get spread quickly and that we tell the people who need to know first, and the people who may be most sensitive or concerned or engaged from a power or interest perspective, we communicate to them first as well. Now, from an organizational politics perspective, we have to realize that politics is really just relationships. And so if we act with skill, timing, and judgment, we can hopefully we'll be lucky, but if we act with skill, timing, and judgment, we can navigate politics successfully. Now, communication is an art. It's something that I think each of us as healthcare managers works to improve every day. We work to understand the local culture within our organizations, the organizational ecosystem, if you will, and try to speak in different manners that appeal to different groups. And we tease that it's local culture in many languages, but everyone communicates differently. And you may know that when you meet with one team, you have to share the information a little differently with a slightly different focus than another team. But we always want to make sure we're being open and honest, building that credibility that's a foundation for our influence, and making sure that we acknowledge and try to manage what we refer to as the authenticity paradox. We as managers can't help but be different based on who we're interacting with. If you go home and you have a conversation with a family member or friend, that communication is going to be different than it would be in the office. They know a different piece of you. You have different shared experiences. But we have to work to authentically be ourselves and be honest and open in all situations, realizing we have many facets. Now, the last slide here, this is our reflection for our module. If you are taking this class online, you'll notice that this is assigned for this module. It's a reflection looking at the Jessica Santolin case. This is a tough case that deals with a young woman who received a heart and lung transplant that was not compatible for her body. And this was at Duke Hospital here in North Carolina at Duke Medical Center. And it was a really heartbreaking situation where the organization really struggled how to communicate this to the family. So please take a moment, review this resource so that you can reflect comprehensively on what you think happened and what we can do as health services administrators to prevent situations like this in the future. All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you for taking time to listen to my presentation. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have a wonderful week.